So we see the first step in consequentialism, right, away from hedonism, uh, some nearly 2,000 years later, with the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, right, who created what he calls the hedonistic calculus. Um, and he, on the basis of hedonism's moral theory. And this was meant to be a means of calculating pleasure with mathematical precision, right? To help figure out what one should do, right? A literal cost-benefit analysis, right? Sort of calculation. And for Bentham, he kind of did away with the hierarchy of pleasures as well, right? He said that pleasure is pleasure and that's all that there is to it. If you're going to do any sort of calculating and determining of pleasure, then it needs to be mathematical. As a result, it can't be based off of something ephemeral like it nurtures the spirit. Right? It has to be more precise and scientific than that. Right? So he identified 7 different categories that form the basis for um, determining pleasure, according to him. Right? Um, and later on in the module, there will be a I'll have you guys do an exercise, right, where I have you chart out your own graph using these 7 ones and calculate what the best activity would be based off of these 7 dimensions for calculating pleasure. Okay, so the 7 dimensions are intensity, or how strong the pleasure is, right? Duration, how long the pleasure lasts. Certainty, how likely it is that the activity will be a source of pleasure, right? How certain is it that you will get pleasure from doing this? Propinquity, which is a very fancy way of saying how soon can I do this, right? Um, the nearness in time for the pleasure, essentially. Fecundity, which is to say how likely is it that doing this will bring more of the same activity along, right? So we still see between propinquity and fecundity and certainty, we still see sort of this idea of the higher and lower pleasures is somewhat preserved, right? Or the active and the difference between the present and the future pleasures, right? With propinquity, at least. And with fecundity, we see the idea and the distinction between the higher and lower pleasures. The lower pleasures are intense and brief, right? And they don't necessarily mean that you'll be able to do more of the same immediately, or even that you're likely to do more of the same. But the higher pleasures, the ones that are more long lasting in nature, the mental, tend to have higher fecundity. Purity. How divorced from pain is the pleasure, right? So how much of it is just pure pleasure? There's no discomfort or intermingling with other negative feelings accompanied with this. And then the extent, right? How many people are going to be affected by this activity, positively or negatively? Um, well, how many people will be affected by the pleasure of the activity? So just positively. Right? Uh, so there is an activity that I want you to do. I want you to, and I believe it's just, I believe it's in the module, and it's essentially I want you to take these 7 dimensions, right, and create a graph, right? It's going to be a 9 by 6 graph. You're going to have 5 activities in the 5 rightmost columns, including sex, philosophy and rock climbing, whatever. Um, I think I list a couple that I want you to include. One of them being philosophy, uh, and then you pick three other activities, and then in the 8 rows, right? For 8 of the rows, I want you to put the actual um, major dimensions, the actual dimensions, right, that we just went over: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. And then below the extent, I want you to put total, right? So you're going to actually calculate these out and come up with a total. And then you're going to determine what activity you should do based off of that. Um, just as a fun way of like playing with his hedonistic calculus. Okay, now, bit of a break here. You done? Okay, good. Hope you had fun. All right, so with this, there are two obvious issues um, regarding this model for calculating pleasure. First, it is completely, as in its entirety, subjective to the person doing the calculations. Right? Um, there's a reason I had you include philosophy in there. For me, doing philosophy is probably going to be the most pleasurable, is almost always going to be the highest thing, unless I'm in a mood of some sort. Right? It's going to be the highest pleasure that I can get. But for you, philosophy might have scored in the middle or lower than the other ones that were on there. Right? So it's entirely subjective to the things that the individual finds pleasurable, without this preset hierarchy that the hedonists had of the higher pleasures being better pleasures and the necessary pleasures being better pleasures, and the natural pleasures being better pleasures. Right? It opens the door for unnatural, lower, and unnecessary pleasures to be a lot higher. Right? You might be the type of person who just enjoys binge watching TV and it brings you so much pleasure. Right? I can't do that to save my life. Right? I can, even my favorite shows, I can watch maybe about like 5 episodes before I have to get up and do things like move and stuff. TV just can't hold my attention. Right? And so we don't get the same degree of pleasure from it that some others do. The second issue with this modeling, this hedonistic calculus, is that why are there only these 7 categories? Why not 8 or 12? Actually, why these 7? Why aren't there 5? Why do we need extent? What does it matter the number of people who are affected by my choice? Right? Right? Everything else just lends to the calculation of my individual pleasure. Why does extent matter? Right? Why does it matter whether doing the thing that brings me pleasure affects other people as well? Why should that be part of the calculation at all? Why not just 6 or 5? Who needs to know about the purity of pleasure, right? If you're into BDSM, then hell, having a more pure pleasure isn't necessarily going to make it more pleasurable, right? The pain might be an element of, doing something that's painful might be an element of the pleasure, right? So purity is not a good measure either. So why not just keep the first 5, right? The intensity, the duration, the certainty, propinquity, and fecundity, right? Those seem to matter. Why not do that? And so we're left with this sort of idea, or this ideal of pleasure that is messy, right? Um, what was supposed to bring greater precision to the calculation of pleasure and determination of what one should do on that basis. In fact, by the abandonment of like a natural hierarchy of pleasures uh, that the hedonist had, Bentham winds up having a messier framework overall. And it's a messy framework that his godson, John Stuart Mill, picks up, runs with, and turns into one of the most comprehensive moral theories um, to ever exist, utilitarianism.